there with Sean Delaney.
I'm Sean Delaney, and today on What Got You There, I sit down with Sebastian Mallaby to talk about his new book, The Power Law, which uncovers the mindsets and the most interesting things he's learned about the greatest venture capitalists of all time. We talk about people like Peter Thiel and Paul Graham of Y Combinator and dive deep into the process behind Sequoia Capital. So if you want to understand the mindsets of the greatest venture capitalists of all time and how you can apply these lessons and mindsets to your own work, you're going to love this conversation with Sebastian Mallaby.
Got you there with Sean Delaney. Got you there with Sean Delaney.
Sebastian, welcome to What Got You There. How are you doing today?
Great. Nice to be with you.
It's very good to see you. So we're going to dive a lot into the different mindsets of some of the legendary investors and venture capitalists that you've studied over the years. What I would love to know, is there a mindset of yours that you just have found to be instrumental in your progress, development, and success you've experienced?
I think, Sean, patience is really important. I mean, what I'm trying to do with my writing is not necessarily to be the most productive guy in terms of like how many books I publish, but to really write good books that hopefully stand the test of time. And for that, you just do need to be patient. You need to wait. You need to, if there's a certain person you need to get to see and it takes you 6 months, you patiently nudge them, figures out different ways of getting to them. Who do they know that you know? Who do you might know that knows somebody who then knows them? You just need to hang in there and not give up, and be persistent and gritty and not be. I think I tell myself this all the time because it's kind of against the culture, right? I mean, we've got a world of social media and instant tweets and all that stuff, and everybody's operating at a very high velocity. I think I differentiate myself by being patient.
Sebastian, it's so funny you mentioned that around the patience. I was just talking to someone actually yesterday about this, and I'm kind of balancing it and back and forth on that teeter-totter between patience and persistence, right? Like I think about it, impatient with action, but patient with results. I'm just wondering how you think about that balance in playing those long-term delayed gratification type games, but also putting forth the necessary effort you need and almost being impatient at times. How do you think about that?
Sure. I mean, by patience, I don't at all mean not working hard. It just means that, with the book or this kind of research that I do, there are always multiple balls that you're juggling in the air. You might have, 15, 20 people that you'd like to get to see. And if one of them is proving to be difficult to reach, you persist with the other 19 and you don't give up. And you certainly, when you get that break, I remember on my most recent book, the one about venture capital that I think we're going to talk about, I was extremely keen to really get inside Sequoia and understand how they functioned. And I'd been trying for a long time. And then I finally figured out that if I went through one of their limited partners, who was kind of like their customer, I might manage to get inside the door. And so I tried this, and this friend of mine who was an LP at one of the major endowments emailed Sequoia, and I got an email back from Doug Leone, the chief investor there, within about 10 minutes. It was a Saturday. And of course, I was right on it. I mean, I immediately emailed back. And when you get that break, you absolutely go for it impatiently. So you're right. But at other times, you've got to calm yourself down. And however hard you might want to push something, you've just got to figure that patience is a virtue.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny. You almost mentioned kind of like getting in the side door there. I'm wondering, do you kind of think about that framework of going in the side door and finding unique ways in everything you do? Or is that just around essentially landing great interviews with people that are usually hard to reach?
Well, in a way, these days, writing books itself is a slightly side door activity, especially the long kind of books that I do, which, take me 5 years or so to research and write. As I was saying, the culture is a very fast culture. It's a very high velocity, quick turnaround type of thing. And even a startup could scale to a $1 billion valuation in the time it takes me to write a book. A woman could have several babies. I mean, I'm really operating quite on a slow cadence, and that I think of that as sort of my differentiation, my variant perception, my you could call it a side door or just a different way of coming at the world. which I think yields a differentiated result and, gets me into conversations, into connecting with people kind of through a side door, because it's not the obvious way of approaching life.
Sebastian, what I appreciate about you and your work and what you're able to do is that you've identified, actually, this long-term approach, 4 years, 5 years to write a book is my style. This might not be other people's styles, but I'm going to push off that external pressure to all of a sudden come out with a book every single year, or just those really fast, instant type things. And I'm wondering, for someone who's younger, earlier in their career, who haven't really built that foundation yet to be absolutely confident in their approach, is there anything you've done throughout your career just to enable yourself to have a stronger foundation in terms of how you operate and work best and allow that work to shine through?
Yeah, and I should make clear, because that's a good point about how do you operate when you're younger. The first couple of books I wrote, one was in my 20s, one was at the end of my 30s. I wrote a lot quicker. The one in my 20s, I wrote very quick. It took about 10 weeks to get most of the writing done. So I haven't always operated like this. And in fact, you sort of need the luxury of having a bit of a name brand, and therefore the financial security to give yourself the time to spend that long on a book, because obviously you need to earn money. And if you just spent 5 years and then it didn't sell very many copies, you'd be in trouble. So what I would say to younger people starting out is that I'm a big believer that you kind of experiment in your career and your life, and you try different things. And when something starts to work, you pursue it. And you don't know ahead of time which thing is going to feel right for you. But I think just energetically going at a lot of different approaches and feeling and finding the way that's best for you is the right way to get to your niche eventually.
It's funny you bring that up. I don't know if you've seen the recent research paper. I forget if it was in Nature, where it was around exploration versus exploitation. And essentially it was saying all of the people who experience the highest return, basically, in terms of what they're able to do in their career. So great authors, great creatives, all of that. It was that process you talked about. Try a lot of things, explore, and then all of a sudden when you find that thing, they go super deep. And that's when their hot streak, I think that the paper might have been titled something about experiencing hot streaks in your career. And it was all about that. I am wondering, though, you mentioned changing the writing style. In your 20s, you wrote that book within 10 weeks. Why for you did that writing style evolve into being such a slow, deep, methodical type process as opposed to that really fast 10-week type approach?
Yeah, it's not something it speaks to your previous point, right? I didn't necessarily premeditate those different choices. They were driven partly by circumstance. In the case of that early book, I'd been a correspondent for The Economist magazine in South Africa. I had been there when Nelson Mandela came out of jail, and I figured, wow, all the other books about South Africa are now out of date and irrelevant. I'm going to write the first post-apartheid, post-Mandela release book. And I was super excited. I'd written a lot of journalism about South Africa. I had a lot of material from the journalism, and I could only negotiate a limited amount of time away from my day job, which was to be an economist journalist. And so I had those 10 weeks, and I just knew I had to get it done, and I did. I think, later on, what's different is partly that the kinds of books I did required, a different sort of research. It's like there's a kind of journalistic overview model of book where you sweep together lots of anecdotes and a few big ideas, and you kind of produce a quick book. When you're trying to recreate and reconstruct a history that nobody's really told before, which is what I've done with, my most recent 3 or 4 books, that just takes more time. You've got to go dig, somewhere where nobody else has dug before. And you're going to dig a lot of dry holes when you do that. You're only going to hit that gusher, which yields usable material every once in 3 or once in 4 times. You'll show up to a lot of interviews and find that you learn nothing. So I was taking on tougher research projects. I'd also become more a perfectionist in my writing. So I think that's not to do with kind of line by line writing, which I think I've always been a bit perfectionist about, but it's more in the structure and a sort of sense that I think a lot of times about how movies work, that, sometimes the director is giving you a wide angle cut, other times it's a close up. If you especially watch TV, you see how quickly the scenes change. Every 15 seconds or something, the camera is pointing at a totally different set of characters. And so you're cutting in between scenes. And I think although books are a different cadence, you have some of the same tricks that you have to, at some points be writing in an analytical, expository way. And then you don't want the reader to get tired of that. So you switch to a narrative section, and sometimes you're homing in and sometimes you're panning out. And you're thinking of moving that camera around all the time. And that just requires quite a lot of patient tweaking to get the balance to where you feel happy with it. So I think I've just become, both more ambitious in the research projects I take on, and then more ambitious in the way that I write them as well.
It's always so intriguing to hear about people pulling from other domains. You mentioned the kind of understanding cinema and film and how you incorporate that into the cadence of the writing process. I actually think about creating a movie in a very similar frame as how you're starting a company, right? Like you gotta find the director, you gotta get all the stagecraft correct, the costumes, everything like that. You got to get the correct people in place, and it kind of forms together, and it's evolution over time. So I just find that really interesting. I would love actually hearing though more about finding those gushers in your research process, right? Like meeting after meeting, not leading to much, then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this just led to something that's just going to be so fascinating in the book. For you, analyzing your entire career, is there one of those gusher type moments where you found something, or it was an interview, a conversation where you were like, wow, this is really going to change things? Anything like that come to mind for you?
Sure. I mean, there's a few of them, but I'll pick one from my biography of Alan Greenspan. I spent 5 or 6 years on that book. And there had been other books about Greenspan before, of course, because he was the Fed chairman for 18 and a half years. He was a big figure. But I wrote one which really went a lot deeper. And one of the times where I really felt I had something which was going to differentiate what I did was that I was determined to kind of recapture the culture of Greenspan's consulting company from before he was Fed chairman. And I went off and I interviewed all the people I could find who had worked for him. And this was back in the 60s and 70s. So it was, quite historical stuff. And I found this man who lived in kind of a clearing in the woods in Virginia, who had been the operator of the punch cards in the old computers that Greenspan had, and had kind of been the guy who fixed the photocopier. And so he was in the office. He was not an economist, but he had seen Greenspan close up. So I wanted to go see him and just say, hey, what was Greenspan like in those days? What kind of man was he? And I also knew that, Greenspan at the time had been really into Ayn Rand. And he'd given a bunch of lectures about Ayn Rand's economics, but nobody had ever told me where to find these lectures. And I looked everywhere and I couldn't find them. And I got talking to this source in his cabin in the woods in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden he says to me that he loves Ayn Rand. So then I put 2 and 2 together in my head. I say, oh, so you were working for Greenspan when he was into Ayn Rand, and he gave those lectures. Do you know anything about those? He said, sure, I love those lectures. I've got the entire transcripts of all of them in my basement. So my eyes get 3 times as wide. I kind of try to contain my excitement because I don't want to it's a bit like hooking a fish. You don't want the fish to swim away. So I kind of pull on the line to hook the source, but not too hard. And I say, wow, that's pretty interesting. Any chance I could take a look at those transcripts? He says, sure, I don't see why not. And a week later, he's photocopied 300 pages, and I have the entire map of my subject's mind, as he crests his late 30s, in a way that nobody had before. And in those 300 pages, I'm reading them, of course, and suddenly Greenspan's writing that the creation of the Federal Reserve is one of the greatest disasters in American history. This is the guy who headed the Federal Reserve, who embodied central banking. And there he was saying that, the creation of the Federal Reserve was a disaster. So that was one gusher that I'll always remember finding.
I can only imagine the amount of even like internal personal satisfaction, right? Like it's even like you're exploring the unknown, and then you find this buried treasure. I think about this myself. I've been really fortunate with the podcast, having some guests share some deeply personal, almost like what's going on in their mind during really interesting parts of their career or their business that they've never shared elsewhere. And seeing inside the mind of someone like that is just truly fascinating to me. So I absolutely loved hearing that story. I'm intrigued analyzing just your work and the progression over time. Has there been a through line for you throughout your entire career? Like, is there something deeper behind every single book that's consistent that you've been trying to get at?
It's a great question. I think the first book was sort of a case of its own, the one about South Africa and Mandela coming out of jail and all that. I later wrote my next book, which was about the World Bank and development economics in poor countries. So there was sort of a connection there because it was about development, and South Africa, of course, was in some ways a developing country. And so there was a link. But the World Bank turned out in a way that I didn't anticipate to be a kind of a hinge book, which got me into writing about development economics. And then I was thinking more about finance. I'd done quite a lot of financial journalism for The Economist magazine, but I hadn't written a book about finance. And then all of a sudden, my editor at Penguin says to me, what about a book on hedge funds? I was thinking about it, and the idea of how you have variant perception in markets, how you are so confident about your opinion that you bet against the entire market and everybody else. That intrigued me psychologically and intellectually. And so I started to look at it. I did that book and it went well. And after that, I decided that writing about financial history and different cuts at financial and business history in kind of the US post-war era, 1960 to now, roughly speaking, is what I was really fascinated by. And so, my book about hedge funds was the history of public market investing and ideas about how you make money in markets from the 1960s until now. My book about Greenspan was a book about central banking and how you manage finance from the 1960s until now. And my venture capital book, which I've just finished, is a book about private market investing, about technology investing from the 1960s until now. So there is a commonality, certainly, to the last three books.
Yeah, I like I mentioned to you, I just thoroughly enjoyed the new book, The Power Law, fascinated by the minds of venture capitalists. I'm wondering for you, is there a consistent mindset amongst all of the people you've studied? I'm thinking Mandela, Greenspan, some of the legends like Soros, even which William Robertson's done at Tiger Capital. Is there something that you're like, you know what? No matter what they're doing, this is a very consistent theme throughout?
I think variant perception and a willingness to kind of take a risk on that variant perception is very important. Most people who make their mark on their world are people who are willing to kind of take a different path to everybody else, because by definition, if you do what everybody else is doing, it's pretty tough to be distinctive at it. And it's so, Mandela, if you think about it, was a person who was willing to, believe in his cause enough to be in jail for 27 years and basically to come out at the end of 27 years with exactly the same set of views about justice in South Africa that he had gone into jail with. I mean, it's a pretty distinctive path. If you think about an investor, there's less self-sacrifice involved, of course, but there is a sense that, you're going to pursue an opinion, a view, a hunch about what the truth is about valuations, about markets, about how the economy is going to develop. And you're going to pursue that even though everybody else thinks you're wrong. I mean, by definition, in the stock market, the price at any given time is the weighted average of everybody's opinion about what the price should be. So if you're saying it's wrong and you're going to bet against that as a hedge fund investor, it takes a lot of conviction, and you probably have had to go off and do a lot of research. It's, people sometimes have this image of investors as being, kind of impulsive, sort of swashbuckling risk takers who kind of just roll the dice and say whatever. I mean, in my experience of interviewing these people, they are normally highly deliberative, and they go deep on some intuition, and they do the work, and they develop enough conviction to bet against everybody else. And clearly in venture capital investing, that's the case, right? You're You're betting on a startup, which by definition, everybody else thinks is doing something crazy, because it's such a long shot, right? I mean, most startups fail, and only a minority get this exponential takeoff. And that's what makes it exciting and challenging and emotionally challenging, right? I mean, Rudolf Berter, who is one of the top people at Sequoia Capital, was talking to me once about how, it's an emotional roller coaster. You start investing as a venture capitalist. Inevitably, a lot of the early bets you make will fail and go to zero. And that will happen faster than the success stories become successes. And so you're going to go through this period when you crash emotionally because you were wrong and you lost your partner's money, and you feel terrible about that. And then a bit later, if you're good or you're lucky or whatever mixture of that two ingredients is, you'll have something that goes really right and you'll be making 10x, 20x, 30x the money that you put in. And you'll go from despondency to elation, right? From being crushed to being in danger of hubris. And you have to regulate your emotions in both directions. And so, these are, these paths that take people to really making an impact on the world involve risk, they involve emotional risk, and they take a lot of gritty, resiliency.
I could go so many different directions because I'm so fascinated by about 10 different things you said right there. But I would actually love to go a little bit further there on the emotional control these people have, because I'm kind of thinking this as a parallel journey between kind of like that self-awareness and your overall success. And I'm wondering, of all the people you've studied, who have you been just thoroughly impressed by in terms of their ability to know thyself and to be able to then cultivate the conditions to most allow their best and highest level of intellectual thinking to shine through? I know that was a lot there. I'm just wondering, like, who operates at their best and then was intentionally creative in cultivating the conditions to allow their best selves to be able to come through.
So I think a very interesting figure that I've studied for my venture capital book is Peter Thiel. He's super controversial because obviously he is a conservative politically in a culture which is broadly libertarian/liberal. He was the only prominent Silicon Valley guy to support Donald Trump in the 2016 race and to give a speech at the convention. So definitely a controversial figure, and I don't agree with everything he does. But what I would say about Peter Thiel is that he's a brilliant guy and he's very self-aware. He thinks through his positions, and when he has arrived at some insight, he does actually have the courage to follow it. I think his biggest insight, which was not original to him, but which he went further in articulating and then acting on, is this idea of the power law, which gave me the title of my book, right? So the power law is the notion that 80% of the investments you make will do nothing, but 20%, or it could be 10%, will account for all of the returns in your portfolio. So this is extremely skewed distribution of outcomes. And from this insight, it follows that the only thing you care about is not losing bets, because you can only lose 1 times your capital that you put in. What matters is trying to get into the ones that are going to go 10x, 20x, 30x. You don't know ex ante which ones those will be, but what you have to force yourself to do ex ante before you invest is only to invest in the ones that are so original, contrarian, and different that they could be a 20x. And so, having decided that, Thiel saw that, cautious bets, sensible bets, sane bets are just a waste of time in his business. It's only worth making really out there, difficult, scary bets. And therefore, it follows from that, you should hire a certain kind of person and you should organize your venture capital partnership in a certain way. he makes a point in his own book, 0 to 1, that of the people who founded PayPal, the payment startup with him, several had built bombs in high school. The point is not their technical ability, it's their craziness. And the craziness meant that they were crazy, but that was a good thing, because people often say, people in Silicon Valley are crazy, these geeks are crazy, gee, that's the culture. No, it's much more specific than that. Unless you are crazy, you won't do something that is crazily different to other people. Therefore, you'll be following in a crowded area to other people. And therefore, even if your idea is pretty good, 10 other people will have the same idea and they'll compete with you, and your profits will be competed away. What you've got to do is have investors working with you who are so different that they're going to come at the whole question of where you should invest in a different way. And yes, sometimes it will be a crazy different way and you will lose all your money. But so long as you can be right 1 time in 10, 2 times in 10, then you will be successful. And I think, Peter Thiel really has pursued that in a way that inspired me to put that idea of the power law as the title of my book. And it's one of those ideas that once you get it and you start looking around at other investors who are doing venture capital, you kind of see the power law everywhere. And I could talk about that, but it was the key that sort of unlocked the secret source of Silicon Valley and technology investing for me.
I would love to talk about that, of seeing the power law everywhere, because it's one of those things, once you see it, you just can't unsee it. And finding those across all domains of life. You had this line about Thiel in the book that I loved, and it's describing him dripping with disdain for incrementalism. And I just love that so much. I was just talking, the episode that went live yesterday on What Got You There was with Snowflake CEO Frank Slootman, and he talks about just an utter disdain for incrementalism. So I loved hearing that about Thiel as well. Before we dive into seeing the power law everywhere, I just have to go a little bit further, because I'm fascinated by Thiel. I think he truly is one of those legendary type, once in a century type thinkers. And you mentioned his thinking process. He has great self-awareness. He goes deep inside of his own intellectual mind and thinks through things. Is there any insights you garnered about what that process is actually like for him? I'll give a quick example and why I'm really fascinated by this. One of the people who I think is excellent at what they do is the basketball coach Phil Jackson, coached the legendary Lakers with Kobe, and then also the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls. And he was huge into visualizing for 45 minutes before each game, going through each scenario, not the successes only, but about when this happens, then that. This is how I handle that setback. And I'm just wondering how this applies to someone like Peter Thiel, who could be one of the most fascinating thinkers in our modern day. So I'm just wondering what Thiel does specifically while he's exploring his own thinking that might just be really interesting.
I think it's instructive that one of his favorite hobbies, and something he did a lot of when he was younger, is chess. He was a very, very accomplished chess player. And of course, chess is about thinking through scenarios into the future, 15, 20 moves ahead, in a very disciplined way that requires a lot of mental bandwidth. And I think, the fact that he was so good at chess probably did translate into being good as an investor, because it is that process of thinking, multiple steps ahead. I'd say the self-awareness leads him also to think to sort of discrete insights beyond the big power law idea, right? So I remember going to speak to him early on, and just he would compare hedge fund investing, which of course he's also tried his hand at, with venture capital investing, and he would just be really smart about comparing the two. And I think that's again another mark of a creative thinker, when you understand two different fields and you can draw from one and apply to the other. It's a bit like what you were saying earlier on about movies and building a business. I think Thiel is very good at that.
I would love to dive further into seeing the power law everywhere, but you had a story in the book that I thought really encapsulates and helps people clearly understand the power law. And that was, sorry if I get his name wrong here, it's Matthew Salganik and the Sugar Man phenomenon. I would love for you to describe that, because I think that's a really concrete example of how the power law plays out here.
Sure. So I've always loved this movie, Searching for Sugar Man, which is about this singer, Rodriguez, who was kind of like a cross between, I don't know, Cat Stevens and Bob Dylan in the early 70s. And he recorded a couple of albums. And in the US, they went nowhere. They sank like a stone. And that was the end of his career recording. The record label dropped him, and he worked construction, and in fact, demolition for much of the rest of his life in Detroit, where he lived. And then in this whole parallel story, which is just sort of, for anyone who's written a book or created a song or done anything creative, it's like, it's just such a sort of, hits you here, right? It's this incredible story about how there can be these parallel worlds where in one you fail, the other you succeed. Because what happened with Rodriguez is that he'd recorded these two albums, they'd failed, but some tourists from South Africa, and I think also from Australia, had been in the US, bought the albums, taken them home, started playing them, loved them, shared them with their friends, and then bootleg copies had circulated both in Australia and South Africa, and they'd become, so popular. They were like, super number one. I mean, you couldn't go, if you were sort of a white teenager of a liberal sort of anti-apartheid disposition in South Africa in the mid-late 70s, you could not go to a party without hearing the album at least a couple of times, and you would know every word of every song. And I checked this, I wrote my first book about South Africa. I know a lot of South Africans. So I called a friend of mine who'd been growing up at that time, and yep, he knew every word of every song. So it's this sort of parallel story. And it got me thinking about the way that, when you start to succeed in some fields in life, more people know about you. Therefore, they tell their friends. Therefore, even more people know about you. And you have this snowball effect where success begets more success. On the other hand, if you fail out of the gate, you'll probably never make it anywhere. So that's why you can have these extreme differences in outcomes. In the US, you can fail totally. In South Africa, you can succeed. And then I came across this research, as you were saying, by Matthew Salganik. I've actually only read his name. I've never met him or spoken to him. So I am also unsure about the pronunciation. But the point of the research is that he did this experiment where he created different playlists. He created one playlist, and he created multiple groups of people who could go listen to these playlists. And he invited people to download a couple of songs that they liked best. And so there'd be one group, and I don't know, there'd be 100 people in the group or something. And the first person would go on there, download a couple of songs. And after about 10 people, one or two songs would have gotten more downloads than the others. And the people who came after that would see the previous downloads, and they would be influenced subtly by that. And so success would feed upon success, and the most downloaded songs would then be even more downloaded. And so at the end of the experiment, you'd have one song that was like the runaway winner, the absolute top bonanza hit. But it would be a different song in each of these parallel worlds, because Salganik had created these multiple groups. So each time there would be a power law style winner takes all outcome, but it would be a different winner, proving that it's this feedback loop. It's not necessarily the quality of the winner that determines success. And so that got me thinking about venture capital more. And it means that you could, in theory, have an investor or an investment partnership that starts out in business, and after a year or two, it gets lucky. It makes an investment that randomly does incredibly well. This creates a reputation, a sort of halo effect. So all of the good entrepreneurs come to that company. And then it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy where, because you've done well, the best entrepreneurs come to you. Because you invest in them, you do well again. And all of a sudden, after 10 years, you look like you're a total genius. And I had that model in mind as I was, looking at venture capitalists. It made me be skeptical as to whether the success came from luck or from skill. I concluded, by the way, that it was skill, but I tested myself on that conviction multiple times.
Yeah, you did a really good job too. In conclusion of the book, I'm pretty sure it was four things that essentially dispelled the complete luck that a lot of people think is the result of venture capital. They think they're completely lucky, where you did a great job disproving that essentially. Well, one of the things I've really enjoyed about the Sugarman phenomenon as well is in some of those different scenarios where the song had finished first overall, in other groups that hadn't seen its success, it finished 40 out of 48. And I just found that like it's so fascinating. I feel like it ties together so many different things we've talked about thus far, right? Like even to start the conversation, you were just mentioning about like the patience but persistence. We're talking about skill versus luck and all these different things. Where certain times like you've got to be more process oriented than outcome oriented, because as we saw there, if you're only outcome oriented, you're going to finish 40 sometimes out of 48, and another time you finish number one overall. I just found that so fascinating. I'm glad you were able to remember that as well as you did, because I thought it encapsulated so much. You've mentioned a few. Yeah, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that actually connects to the power law idea, because it tells you why you need a lot of shots on goal, right? I mean, because you can't control the outcome, you can only control the process. If you just had one shot, that might not be enough. And so the lucky thing for venture capitalists is they get multiple shots on goal.
Speaking of multiple shots on goal, I'm just thinking, knowing you and how methodical and how long it takes you to write a book, I know you came across the power law concept and found this so interesting along with hedge funds, venture capitalists in this instance. But I'm wondering for you, like, when do you finally reach that boiling point of 212 degrees where you say, you know what, I'm actually going to spend the next 4 to 5 years of my life and fully commit to this book? Is that like an evolution, or is there a defining, like draw the line in the sand type moment where you finally fully commit?
I mean, it's mostly an evolution, right? Because you sort of, you have a conversation with a friend that gives you an idea, you look at it, you might throw it out, but that's sort of like the seed investment. And then if you decide it is quite interesting, then you'll invest, a month or whatever in checking it out. And that's sort of your Series A maybe. And then if you get past that and you reach the milestone, which is that you still find it interesting and you think you also might have something distinctive to say about it, and you've checked out the existing books in that field and you reckon there's space for you to add value, then you keep going. At a certain point, there is sort of a crossing of the Rubicon, because you write in advance in the publishing business. You write a proposal. That's sort of like a 40-page pitch deck. It's not a deck, it's a piece of prose, but it's the same function. You show it to your real funder at this point, who is the publishers, and you try to get investment in the form of a book advance. And then once you've gotten that, then you're kind of committed. But you're not committed necessarily to a specific outcome, because and the publisher knows that what you write in the proposal is just your best thinking at the time. And if you're going to spend, a further, by this point, you're maybe 1 year in. So you're going to spend another 3 years or so before delivering a final, even something close to a final draft. And so if you didn't evolve in those 3 years, you would be a pretty boring person, right? If you're creative, you're always finding new avenues, adjusting, pivoting and figuring out where the real truth is. And so you do evolve. It is a process all the way through. And so I think, to your question, it's more of an evolution than reaching one boiling point and that's it.
Speaking of that evolution, I'm wondering, is there one of those once you see it, you can't unsee it, was part of the power law writing process, that now, like, writing this book fundamentally changed you? And I'm hoping there might be something other than just seeing the power law and asymmetric opportunities. Was there something else that maybe during one of those deep conversations with the legendary venture capitalist, you just couldn't unsee once you heard it?
Well, I remember talking to Mike Moritz, who for a long time was the leader of Sequoia Capital. And he's an interesting figure because he'd written 2 or 3 books, 2 books before he became a venture capitalist, and at least one since then.
Quick question on this. So you say Moritz, my ears clearly perked up. Didn't he write a book that he only sent out to Sequoia people, but it's like this legendary unknown document? Am I wrong in this? Or I feel like someone was sharing that example with me. I'm just generally curious on this.
Yeah, that's true. He
Okay.
wrote a book about the founder of Sequoia, which he gave to me, but it's a privately published book, and,
Yep.
and not, you can't just go on Amazon.
I tried.
But what he said to me, which I found flattering but also interesting, is that in some ways doing a startup is a bit like writing a book. You know, you suffer rejection at the outset. People think you're a bit crazy. You're going into some slightly niche-y thing, and you're going to spend years on it. You get a lot of kind of weird looks at the beginning. And then hopefully, if you persist long enough and you create something of value, then you get, recognition, but you have to wait for it and you have to earn it. And you don't know ahead of time that you'll ever actually reach the promised land. You might not, if you write a book that turns out to be no good. So, there's that risk, there's that commitment in your own path. You will get rejection. You have to bounce back from that. And you have to have the grittiness to keep going. And once Moritz said that to me, it did make sense and it stuck with me.
Do you reach that valley of despair moment in the process of writing books at this point in your career?
I mean, I must admit, it's less of a roller coaster than it was maybe 3 books ago, because I know that I have a process. I know it works. I've done it before. And I know that there will be moments when you dig 3 or 4 wells and they're all dry and you're out of luck for a month. But in the end, something will work out. And you have to have, at this point, I have enough faith in myself that I believe that I'll make it work.
Speaking of that process, would you view that as an overall philosophy, essentially, of how you approach work?
Well, it certainly kind of bleeds outside of just sitting at the computer writing or just pumping out emails and LinkedIn messages and working my network to get the access I need. It extends to sort of like how I try to regulate the rhythms of my life outside work. I mean, I think it's important for me to exercise a lot because it's a very sedentary way of life. And so if you don't, get on that Peloton bike or whatever it is that you like before breakfast, in my case, pretty much every day, you're just not going to work well. If you don't maintain friendships, and, I'm lucky to be married to somebody who connects with me intellectually as well as in other ways. And, if I don't make time for that, I just won't function well as a writer. And I've kind of learned to see that part of the patience and perseverance and sticking to it over a long period is to have a balance in how you're approaching your life.
I'd actually like to hear a great example of someone that you've researched over time that you thought had a really unique way in terms of crafting their own environment and then cultivating those conditions for them to thrive best in their career. Is there anyone that comes to mind for you in terms of unique approaches, in terms of how they went about their work?
Well, you said something earlier, Sean, about the basketball coach who kind of would always think through the scenarios before the game. And that is like Paul Tudor Jones, the legendary hedge fund trader, who told me that he would, sit in the evenings at home in a dark room and close his eyes and think through what might happen tomorrow in the markets. If oil went up, what would he do about his positions in Japanese equities? If the bond market sold off in the US, how would that translate into his view on European commodity stocks? He had these connections in his head, and he was thinking about how this play could lead to that play, could lead to the other one. And so if he could figure out the 3rd or 4th domino in that pile of dominoes that was going to keel over and one would hit the next and would hit the next, he could be trading the 3rd and the 4th domino ahead of everybody else. And that's how he would make money. So that always stuck with me as a sort of, close your eyes and think through what might happen tomorrow.
the people who know me best are probably smiling and perking up right now, because this is actually like part of my process. So even this morning, I sit down and I'm literally thinking about how my conversation with you, Sebastian, is going to go, and what I'm going to ask, and how you're going to say something, and then based on that, like, there's all these different variables. But I don't know, even in my investment process, it's what I do as well. It's like, how many different doors can you open, and how many different routes can you figure out to that? So hearing you talk about Tudor Jones is very interesting, because like with anything in life, right? You hear someone who does the same process as you. It's just really interesting to me. So I'm just glad you shared that story there. I would love to go a little bit further on Sequoia though, because you want to talk about probably the best of all time potentially. I'm just fascinated by them, and I know you got to look, let's just say, underneath the hood and see some more interesting things. What else do they uniquely do that you feel like has really contributed to their overall success? Is there anything that just comes to mind instantaneously for you with regards to that?
I think there's two things I would highlight. I mean, there's a whole bunch, and I did spend a lot of time with all the top Sequoia people, and I wrote a lot about them in my book. And I think they opened up to me in a way which they hadn't done before. And they said to me halfway through the process, "We have decided that you are high ROI." So,
what an unbelievable compliment.
I took that as a big compliment, but expressed in this wonderfully financial way that made me laugh. But I think my conclusion from all those discussions with them was twofold. One is that they invested in their own process and in their own culture very deliberately indeed, in a way that is different, I think, to not all, but most other venture partnerships. So, I mean, a lot of VC partnerships are sort of collectives of smart investment partners who all go out, they eat what they kill, even if they meet on Mondays for the partners meeting to kind of vote on deals, or they confer with each other, or they might even work together on a deal. It's kind of ad hoc. And they improvise their way to where they need to be, and they're happy that way. And I think if you look at the formation, say, of Benchmark, a super successful partnership in 1995, it was almost sort of self-consciously that they would have 5 people who would be super similar to each other, and who would share an approach. They wouldn't even need to discuss how they interacted together, because it would just be so natural. And like a basketball team or something, they would go out in the court and they wouldn't need the coach, right? They would just go do it. And they were quite deliberate and thoughtful about how each of them interacted as individuals with the portfolio companies, right? I talked to all of the early partners, and I have a lot of respect for their thoughtfulness. But they didn't direct that thought really to their relationships with each other, because they were so natural that they didn't feel like it required that. Sequoia, on the other hand, has devoted enormous amounts of attention to their internal process. And so, one of Mike Moritz's sort of favorite jokes is, people ask me, what was my favorite investment? Was it when I invested in Yahoo? Was it when I invested in Google? Was it when I invested in Stripe? No, it was none of these. It's when I invested in Sequoia, meaning when I put my energy and my thoughtfulness into the glue within the building between me and my partners, between those partners and each other, whether that means the way we onboard and train a new recruit. And, Rudolf Bertha shared with me his experience of when he came into Sequoia, how he was turned from being, a brilliant young guy into a really top of the field venture capitalist. It's a different thing. You have to learn new habits and new emotional self-regulation, as I was saying before. He learned that because Sequoia deliberately taught him, right? There was a process there that made it happen. Sequoia brought in behavioral scientists to sort of studies decision science and teach them how to get better at making collective decisions as a group, not to anchor on each other, not to fall for loss aversion, not to have confirmation bias where you turn down the Series A. So now you want to say in the Series B that the company is no good because that's what you said the last time. You want to make yourself feel good, right? So there were all these very deliberate ways in which the partnership sort of figured out its internal bonding. That's point number one. And the second point about Sequoia is that they were willing to take risks with the franchise by going into new businesses in a really gutsy way. So, the first move they did was to go from early stage into the growth business. They went geographically into China. They went into India and Southeast Asia. Now they've gone into Europe. They moved into public markets investing with a hedge fund business. They went into sort of an endowment fund with a thing called the heritage business, which they have. So time and again, they've innovated the model in a way that was risky. And that's what's kept them ahead of the game. And I think that's what makes them the, kind of the pace setter for venture capital.
I'm fascinated by point number one there around the process, and my inner nerd's just exploding here, thinking about what are some of those other things you mentioned, like bringing even behavioral psychologists and scientists to help better understand decision making. Was there anything else that they do that you just, when you came across, were like, wow, that's really unique and interesting?
Sure. I mean, a good example, right, is the way that, when you start to research venture capital, if you're thoughtful and a little bit analytical about it, your bullshit detector goes up pretty fast, right? You hear all these stories about, I would meet an entrepreneur and I'd say, well, how come you took capital from this investor? Or I'd meet the investor and say, how did you get into that deal? And it would always be some story like, gee, I happen to, enjoy bicycling, and the investor enjoyed bicycling. And so we talked about, which of us had the better time on some stretch of road, right, in the Portola Valley. And so then we got on and then I invested, that kind of, it's like, come on, this sort of serendipity stuff. It's cute. It's fun. I can see why people enjoy telling these stories, but it's not really meaty or satisfying intellectually. And so I was really keen to kind of get behind these stories. And in fact, that bicycling story I just gave you an example of is a real story that Patrick Collison, the co-founder of Stripe, had told me about. When he'd gone to see Michael Moritz at Sequoia, he had gone on his bicycle, and Moritz had had a conversation with him. He'd walked him out of the building, and outside the building, there was Collison's bike, a Cervelo road bike. And Moritz said, wow, do you go everywhere on that? What's your best time on the stretch of, what they call the old La Honda, which is a very grueling stretch from the Portola Valley up to the Skyline Boulevard. And so that was the story that I'd been told about the investment in Stripe. But then you dig a little deeper and you see the process, right, to your question. And the process, and this took me on the patient's question, this took me sort of 3 years from hearing that first anecdote to hearing what the real story was behind the anecdote. The real story is that when Patrick Collison came to Silicon Valley, the first person he called was Paul Graham, the Y Combinator founder, because he had known him when he had set up his earlier company before Stripe. And Paul Graham did an angel investment. And the reason that Sequoia did the Series A was that Paul Graham had a relationship with Sequoia that Sequoia had really cultivated carefully. Sequoia had recognized that Y Combinator was going to be a pipeline of great Series A opportunities. And so it had provided capital to Y Combinator to do its own follow-on investing. And it really built that relationship. And out of that came investments in Airbnb, in Dropbox. And out of it also came Stripe, because when Collison was ready to go beyond that seed check from Paul Graham, and he said to Paul, I think I'm ready for the Series A, the first VC partnership that Graham telephoned was, of course, Sequoia. So Sequoia, got to Stripe first. And sure, it was nice to bond over the bicycling, right? But that wasn't the real story. And so it was that process of deliberately building the Sequoia network by partnering with partnering with Y Combinator by setting up what they call the Scouts program, which is a clever idea, which I think everybody else has now copied, where you go to the entrepreneurs in your portfolio and you say, hey, you haven't exited yet, you don't have a lot of money yet to play with, you may be worth a lot of money on paper, but it's not liquid money you can go do seed checks with. So we'll give you the seed check money. You go invest it. We'll split the proceeds from that. But of course, what Sequoia really wants is not the proceeds from the seed check. It's having the recipient of the seed check on the Sequoia radar, so that they know what's coming down the pike in terms of Series A opportunities. And so it's that network construction, that deal flow pipeline construction, which doesn't just happen by itself. You think strategically about how to create it.
Yeah, this has me thinking specifically about you, Sebastian, because you mentioned earlier reaching out to one of the LPs in Sequoia and got introduced into an email to Doug. And I mean, it's a great story and all, but like, there's so much more there. I feel like why a company like Sequoia lets you so deep into their internal processes and then actually goes to say that you provide them a great ROI. You've gotten behind the curtain of so many fascinating people and companies that very few people on this planet have ever been able to do. So I'm wondering, the self-awareness you have, what is it that you've done distinctly unique that has allowed you to do that isn't part of building up your credibility and name? There has to be more than that, because there's plenty of great reporters or people writing a book who've got unbelievable names, but these companies and these people don't let them see behind the curtain. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you've kind of just overall awareness have built up and realized, what, there's probably more here to this.
I think beyond the patience point that I mentioned earlier, I think it's hard work and honesty and openness. So on the hard work side, I mean, this is something that, any good interviewer would say, I know you've spent the weekend reading my book, The Power Law, and thank you. But without that preparation, you wouldn't be able to ask me good questions. And without thinking through in your own mind, how one question might lead to another question and doing that mental preparation that you talked about, this wouldn't be such a good conversation. And I very much believe that. When I was a journalist at the Washington Post for a bit, I remember speaking to Steve Cole, a very accomplished writer who later became the dean of the Columbia School of Journalism. And Steve was, gave me a tip that stuck with me, which is, you're going to go interview these people and you're going to ask them to reconstruct events which might be 10 years ago or perhaps even more than that. And their memories are going to be a little bit rusty. So what you do is you find out every single data point about them that exists, like all of it. Every YouTube interview they've given, every tweet they've sent, every time they've been quoted anywhere. And you put all that together, you synthesize it in your mind, you create a big document that has all of that in there. And you figure out chronologically kind of how they went through certain episodes, which you see as exciting and worth recreating in your book. And you walk into the interview with a timeline that says, all right, I know that on Tuesday morning, you were in this place because you sent a tweet out saying that's where you were. And I know that on Tuesday afternoon, you had gone to the other place because that's when you met the other guy and you had that meeting. So let's just talk about that. How did you get from the first place to the second place? Did you drive? Did you get a ride with somebody? And then you're jogging their memory. And oh yeah, I drove with my friend. And that was interesting because on the way we were talking about this and he made this good point to me. And that's why when I had that meeting, I approached it this way, not the other way. And so it's by providing the scaffolding for people's memories that you get the rest out. I kind of think of myself sometimes as walking in kind of with the, those juice powders that you add water and stir.
Yeah.
I've got the powder and I'm asking for the water and I want to do a joint effort of stirring, right? But obviously it takes a lot of time to prepare to create those chronologies. I'm fortunate that, I these days have a research associate working with me who can help because it's very labor intensive indeed. But I really believe in this sort of deep, intensive preparation. Second thing I said was openness and honesty. And I have a different approach here, I think, than some people. Journalists often feel, and their editors often feel at newspapers, that it's a bad thing to be too open with the subjects you're writing about, that you should ask questions, but not necessarily say what's behind them. You shouldn't necessarily agree to share the text of what you've written afterwards and invite comments. And I just fundamentally, I mean, I thought about this carefully, and I just think that's wrong. I think it's wrong. And the reason I think it's wrong is that if you say to somebody you're writing about, look, here's the deal. I'm going to share with you what I write. I'm not promising to change it, right? I have the right to say what I believe and what I think and what I've analyzed and what I've concluded. But you have the right to comment on it. And I want to hear your comments, because if I've made a factual error, I want to hear that. If I've left something out, I want to hear that. And if my interpretation is wrong, I want to hear that, even if I end up disagreeing with you and not changing it, right? And so I go through this process of, first of all, that builds some confidence ahead of time, that people think, okay, this is going to be, I'm not going to be sandbagged, I'm not going to be ambushed, and I am going to be involved in a process where I don't get to control the outcome, but I do get to be sure I'm having input, right? Meaningful input. And then secondly, I do what I promise. You know, I write, I create a draft that I'm feeling good about. I share, you know, that piece of the chapter that relates to this person. And I say, and I share the context around, I send them 10 pages or something, right? And I say, hey, you know, all comments, anything you want to tell me, I'm listening. And sometimes I just get back, you know, that's great. Sometimes I get back, you know, on page 7, you know, you got the date wrong. And sometimes I get a 3-hour phone call where we really debate the issues and like how I could have framed the whole thing differently. And then I have a think about it. Sometimes I change, sometimes I don't. I don't have to change it. But I think that sort of second round, you know, often gets me, you know, deeper. It can be intellectually stressful, right? Because you've already spent hours and hours and hours generating the first draft that you're happy with. But when you go back and you rip it up and you redo it, you get to a deeper truth. And so I believe this process creates, you know, something that is closer to really reconstructing and recreating how my subjects think, how they come at the world, how they're different from other people, how they get to where they've gotten, to use your terminology, right? Other writers and editors and newspaper people would say, I shouldn't be playing such an open hand, that it might corrupt me in some way. I disagree.
Speaking of how certain people think, wow, that last 3 minutes, understanding how you think, the humility that requires, the self-awareness, the understanding, the vulnerability there to have your ideas, your writing picked apart there, I just think is awesome. And Sebastian, I need to thank you personally. One of the things I don't do a good job of, that I can do a much better job of, is, like you just said, provide the scaffolding to jog someone's memory, where I hear someone bring up a specific thing or I read about it in a transcript and I think instantaneously they'll be able to rewind back into that moment. And I forget, I've got to craft the conditions to allow them to get back to that place. So for me personally, I don't know if anyone else got that point, but I just thought that was so important for me. I know.
Sure. And just on that, I should warn you though. So that works for me because, you know, if I get no answer, like the person still doesn't remember anything, I just leave it out. I'm not sure how you're going to edit this conversation, but you know, sometimes you try that scaffolding technique and it doesn't work. It doesn't jog people's memory. It's a dry hole that you've just drilled, and you have to just throw it out and try it the next time. You know.
Oh, absolutely. So a few final ones here I'm just really intrigued by. I'm sure this would be an incredibly hard question to answer. I am wondering though, all the people you've researched, you've studied, if you were able to just go for a year and just essentially shadow this person, who would you think you could just learn the most interesting things and you'd walk away just an incredibly different person? Is there someone you would love to be able to shadow if you had to?
Well, that's a great question. I'm intrigued, like everybody, by the whole world of Web3 and the metaverse and crypto. And I don't write a whole lot about it really at all in my book, but I am fascinated by it. And so, I'd love to shadow a great investor who follows Web3 really closely and understand this, because I firmly believe that something is going to come out of this. I think we're at a kind of, the internet right before Netscape was created. We haven't quite got the killer app yet that will make it go mainstream, but there's so much talent going into this space that somebody's going to create it. So we need to identify, who the Marc Andreessen is going to be of Web3. And in some ways, funnily enough, it might be Marc Andreessen, right? Because it's his firm, Andreessen Horowitz, which has put so much resources into making bets on the metaverse. So I'd love to shadow him or Chris Dixon or somebody over there to kind of get inside the cockpit and see how that's working.
Speaking of transition and change, what do you think the evolution of venture capital is going to be like moving forward?
It's a really great question, because on the one hand, you've got this, shift to scale, right? Where growth capital has exploded in size. Going public has become something that people delay. And so a lot of kind of dollar growth in total VC numbers, which we know are, has just gone off the charts in the last couple of years. A lot of that growth is late stage growth. I see that as something that may stick around, may not stick around. It might depend a bit on how regulation affects companies' choices of whether to go public or whether to stay private. But I actually don't see it as kind of like the really fascinating world-changing piece of venture. What I think is, really world-changing is more sort of scaling the early part of the funnel. In other words, having a world in which the ability to raise a C check, a Series A check, a Series B check, that early part of the entrepreneurial journey is not only no longer just confined to Silicon Valley, which, we've already passed that stage where it's broken out of the valley, but is really globalized, fundamentally. And so we've already seen it move into China, we've seen it move into India and Southeast Asia, and now it's coming to Europe, and it's beginning in Latin America to take off. But I really think this thing could be taken a whole lot further, right? And so I'm super excited by, there's a small outfit called, I think it's called Pioneer, which was started by an alumnus of Y Combinator.
Yeah, Daniel Gross. We've actually,
exactly.
I know Daniel pretty well. Yeah, we've had him on a few times. So very interesting look in finding undiscovered talent and then providing talent the resources. Yeah, that's Pioneer.
I think Pioneer and things like Daniel is doing is the big future. I think, Entrepreneur First, which is run by somebody I quote in the book called Matt Clifford, London-based, but it's now gone global, which is another kind of YC, a variant on YC, a way of incubating AI startups. I think putting more and more globalized energy into giving people a path where you don't have to choose between joining company A or company B. You could just join, your own company that you start. I think that developing that pipeline of new startups is the most exciting thing that I'm looking forward to watching.
Yeah, me too. Speaking of giving people that energy and that power to do their own craft, one of the things that have done that for me is books. And obviously, I found your books fascinating. We're going to talk more about those in a second, but you're sitting in front of a massive bookcase. I would love to know, have there been a few books for you that, let's just call them foundational books, that you thought were really instrumental for you and you might even go back to time and again?
I'm a fan of Roger Lowenstein, who's a financial writer who did the long-term capital management book called When Genius Failed. He wrote a great biography of Warren Buffett. And I've gone back to those books, actually, particularly the Buffett book, just a way of describing value investing and how Buffett thought about it. So he was a bit of a role model for me when I was writing my book about hedge funds. Other examples, there's a slightly different book. There's Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, helped me to think about venture and startups, as I was saying earlier. I think The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz is a great book about the stress and trauma and heartache of starting a company. And he did this, he went through the dot-com crash as a startup founder, and it was not fun, but he came through the other end, and I thought that was an inspirational book. So I'd name those three.
I love it. We're going to link everyone up with your books here in a minute, but I would love to know if you could do this long form conversation, sit down with anyone dead or alive, just not a family member or friend, who would you thoroughly enjoy having a deep dive conversation with?
I would be intrigued to do this with Masayoshi Son of SoftBank. Yeah. And the reason is I pride myself on getting to see, just about all the people I write about. And I think I'm better at that than most researchers. But I have to confess that Son is one person I never managed to see, because at the point where I'd kind of penetrated his operation, I'd spoken to various people who had worked for him. I'd gone back and spoken to them a second time. I'd figured out kind of, who he was, where he came from, what I think I know what makes him tick. But, this was the moment when WeWork was going down the tubes, and a bunch of his other investments were going down the tubes. And he was it was just completely the wrong moment to try and approach him. So I think I would have interviewed him if the timing had been different, and if I'd been even more patient than I was, and waited, another couple of years to publish this book. I'm sure would have seen him, but I didn't get to see him. And he's somebody who is fascinating because he's reinvented himself so many times. And he was a software entrepreneur in Japan. Then he was a tech investor in the late 90s. He got killed by the NASDAQ bubble imploding. But he picked himself up with his famous Alibaba investment, and did fantastically well. Then the wave crested when he had the Vision Fund, and that went wrong with WeWork. And he came back again with investing in the public equity market at the depths after COVID hit. So he just has this pick himself up again risk appetite. I think it probably comes from his distinctive Korean Japanese roots. Korean people are marginalized in Japan, and so he always had a really bitter, I think, outsider's feeling about how he came at the world. But I would love some sort of further test and deepen my understanding of his psychology.
Yeah, that would be fascinating to read your insights on that. We're going to have everything linked up with you, your books, your previous books, and the newest one, The Power Law, which we'll have some parting words here in a minute. But I just wanted to let you know, your earlier books, as you know, The Man Who Knew About Greenspan, that was the first book of yours I got introduced to you on, and I just loved it. And then obviously More Money Than God about the hedge funds, I thought was interesting. And then I had so much joy getting to dive deep into The Power Law, which is your newest book, all about venture capital, because you do such an incredible job getting these unique insights that others don't get, but then you're able to weave this interesting storytelling that kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat, while also pulling apart and teasing out some of these big foundational mindsets and strategies that the best of the best use. So it's so applicable, but it's also one of those really enjoyable reads. And that's not always the case with people. So I just wanted to let you know, I really do enjoy your work, especially the last book, The Power Law. So I just wanted to say thank you for putting out great work. And just want to make sure, do you have any final words about the book, The Power Law? Of course, it's going to be linked up. I know we covered a lot of the unique, interesting things, but there's so much more in this book. I just wanted to see if you had anything left to say about it.
I guess the last thing I would say is simply that, my feeling about, the long history of capitalism, if you'll permit me to end on a kind of rather grand, even grandiose note. But I do think that different arrangements come along every so often that fundamentally change the way that capitalism works. And so, in the late 19th century, it was really the invention of the joint stock limited liability company that made possible the creation of all the big corporations that we now know of in America. And so that legal innovation was super important. If you go forward maybe a century or so, you see the rise of junk bonds and the leverage buyout as what enabled that whole wave of unbundling and re-engineering and the kind of lean corporation, the GE type model of the 1990s, fundamentally changed the way that American capitalism worked. It was pretty brutal, but it was super competitive. And I think we're now at a time where this venture capital investment that I write about in my book kind of is the investment model that everybody needs to understand to get where capitalism is at. I mean, Sequoia today is like Goldman Sachs 20 years ago. It is the financial company that tells you how the world is operating, where it's going, and how it's going to move. And the reason is partly that it's not just that we've got Web3 or that we've got certain specific technologies. It's bigger than that. The reason is that fundamentally the economy has moved towards where the value is intangible. It's not physical assets that we care about. It's intellectual property, it's ideas, it's patents, it's new software, it's drug development. It's all of these business processes. And these ideas are things that are difficult to value if you're an accountant putting together financial statements, right? To value them, you've got to be a hands-on investor who gets close to the company, who knows if a given software project is worth a lot or nothing. And that's what venture capitalists ultimately bring. They figured out a way of coming at the world that really gets them into the intangible economy and enables it to make it, to make it really buzz. And that's what my book is trying to explain to people.
Sebastian, this was a fascinating, thoroughly enjoyable conversation. So I can't thank you enough for joining us on What Got You There.
Terrific. Great to be with you, Sean.
Got you there with Sean Delaney. Got you there.
And I want to thank you for watching another powerful episode of the What Got You There podcast. We drop new episodes every single Sunday. So if you subscribe to the page, you'll be the first one to see these powerful episodes. Remember, we deconstruct world-class performers to understand their strategy, tactics, and the routines they've used to help them become world-class in what they do. So if you want to understand and then implement these into your own life, you're going to want to subscribe to the page. Remember, we also put out a weekly newsletter called Momentum Monday, which is just a quick synthesis of everything I've been reading, listening to, and watching behind the scenes. You can stay up to date and follow everything we're doing at whatgotyouthere.com.
Got you there with Sean Delaney. Got you there.